The mud pits of Egypt did not care about the dreams of those who laboured in them. They swallowed dignity and hope with equal indifference, extracting from human bodies the raw material for Pharaoh's monuments, while extracting from human spirits the will to imagine anything beyond the next sunrise. The slaves who mixed straw with clay and formed bricks under the relentless Egyptian sun had learned not to dream too loudly, not to hope too visibly, not to remember that their ancestors had once been free men who answered to no king but the God who had called Abraham from Ur and promised him descendants as numerous as the stars. Caleb was born into this world of suppressed dreams, his first breath drawn in the shadow of oppression, his first cries joining the chorus of a people who had forgotten how to hope. His name meant dog in the Hebrew tongue, perhaps a name given in self-deprecation by parents who had internalized Egyptian contempt, or perhaps a name that carried defiance, for dogs were fierce and loyal, survivors who endured what would break weaker creatures. Either way, the child who bore this name would grow to embody both its humility and its hidden strength, becoming a man whose devotion would be legendary and whose tenacity would outlast every obstacle placed in his path. His origins were complicated in ways that would later prove significant. Caleb was a Kenizzite, descended from Kenaz, a clan that had been absorbed into the tribe of Judah, but whose bloodline traced back to different roots than the children of Jacob. He was an Israelite by adoption and association, rather than by pure genealogy, a grafted branch on the family tree of Abraham's descendants. In a community that would later become obsessed with purity of lineage, Caleb's mixed heritage might have marked him as an outsider. Instead, it would become a testimony to the expansiveness of God's purposes, that faith, not blood, was the true measure of belonging. That wholehearted devotion, not genetic credential, determined one's place in the people of God. The Egypt of Caleb's youth was a land of contradictions. Its civilization represented the height of human achievement, monuments that scraped the sky, irrigation systems that transformed desert into garden, a bureaucracy capable of organizing the labor of millions. Yet for the Hebrew slaves who built those monuments and dug those irrigation channels, Egypt was simply a prison whose walls extended to every horizon. They had been in this land for over 400 years, long enough that the original sojourn had calcified into permanent bondage, long enough that the God who had spoken to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob had fallen largely silent, long enough that many had begun to wonder whether the promises made to their ancestors were anything more than stories told to children who would grow up to discover that stories did not fill empty bellies or heal broken backs. The work was brutal. Hebrew slaves laboured from before sunrise until after sunset, their bodies bent under loads of brick and stone, their skin cracked and bleeding from the mixture of mud and straw that formed the raw material of Pharaoh's ambitions. Overseers with whips ensured that quotas were met. Failure meant beatings, and severe failure meant death. The population was controlled through infanticide. Pharaoh had ordered the killing of Hebrew male babies, fearing that the slave population was growing too numerous, too strong, too potentially rebellious. Life began in threat and continued in toil, with death waiting at the end of a road that offered no exits along the way. Caleb grew in this environment, his body hardening under labour that would have broken weaker men, his spirit somehow remaining unbroken despite circumstances designed to crush the spirit entirely. There was something in him that refused to accept the verdict that Egypt had pronounced over his people, something that looked at the monuments built by Hebrew hands and imagined those same hands building something else, something for themselves, something free. He did not know where this defiance came from. He only knew that it burned in him like a coal that the mud pits could not extinguish, a fire that the Egyptian sun could not outshine. He watched the older slaves with a mixture of compassion and determination, compassion for their suffering, determination not to let their resignation become his own. He saw men who had given up, whose eyes had gone dull with decades of hopelessness, whose movements were mechanical repetitions of tasks that no longer required conscious thought. He saw women who wept in the darkness after their children were taken, whose grief had become as constant as breathing, whose prayers had dwindled to whispers and then to silence. He understood why they had surrendered. He simply refused to join them, and then Moses came. The story of Moses' return to Egypt reached the slave communities in fragments and rumours before it cohered into a narrative that could be believed. A Hebrew raised in Pharaoh's palace, who had fled decades ago after killing an Egyptian, had returned with a message from the god of their fathers. He claimed that Waichbabucht, the name that had not been spoken with confidence in generations, had appeared to him in the wilderness, had commissioned him to demand Israel's release, had promised deliverance that would finally answer 4 centuries of accumulated prayer. Caleb listened to these rumours with something kindling in his chest that he hesitated to name. Hope was dangerous in Egypt. Hope could be crushed, and crushed hope was worse than no hope at all. But there was something about the persistence of the reports, something about the specific details that kept emerging, that suggested this was more than wishful thinking, more than another false dawn that would fade into the familiar darkness. Then the signs began. The Nile turned to blood, its sacred waters becoming undrinkable, the fish dying in rotting multitudes along the shores. Frogs swarmed from the river in numbers that defied comprehension, filling houses and beds and kneading bowls, dying in piles that stank of divine displeasure. Gnats and flies descended in clouds that made breathing difficult and life miserable. Livestock died, boils erupted on Egyptian flesh, hail shattered crops and killed those caught in the open, locusts devoured what the hail had spared, darkness covered the land for 3 days, a darkness so thick it could be felt, so complete, that the Egyptians could not see one another, while Goshen, where the Hebrews lived, remained illuminated. Each plague was a confrontation between Yahweh and the gods of Egypt, a systematic dismantling of the power structures that had held Israel in bondage. The Nile was divine to the Egyptians, and Yahweh turned it to blood. The sun was Pharaoh's father, and Yah blotted it from the sky. The entire pantheon that had legitimized Egyptian authority was being exposed as powerless before the God who had remembered his people, who had heard their groaning, who was coming down to deliver them. Caleb watched the plagues unfold with growing certainty that something unprecedented was happening. The God of Abraham was real. The promises made to the patriarchs were not merely stories but foundations upon which a new future could be built. The oppression that had seemed eternal was about to end, broken not by Hebrew resistance, for what could slaves do against the might of Egypt, but by divine intervention that no human power could withstand. The night of Passover burned itself into Caleb's memory with an intensity that would never fade. He was there when the lamb was selected, when its blood was painted on the doorposts of his family's dwelling, when the meat was roasted and eaten with bitter herbs and unleavened bread. He was there when the instructions were given. Eat with your staff in hand, with your sandals on your feet, ready to leave at a moment's notice. He was there in the darkness of that night when death passed through Egypt, when the screams of Egyptian families pierced the silence, when the firstborn of an entire nation fell in a single hour, while the blood on Hebrew doorposts marked the boundary that death could not cross. That night, Caleb understood what it meant to be chosen, to be protected, to be marked for deliverance when destruction fell on every side. The blood of the Lamb had stood between him and judgment, had identified his household as belonging to the God who was finally acting on behalf of his people. The faith that had been kindling in his heart burst into full flame. This God was worthy of complete devotion, of wholehearted loyalty, of a commitment that would never waver regardless of what the future might hold. The Exodus itself was a chaos of liberation. Suddenly, impossibly, Pharaoh was demanding that the Hebrews leave. Egyptian neighbours were pressing gold and silver and clothing into Hebrew hands. A nation of slaves was walking out of bondage with the wealth of their oppressors loaded onto their backs. Caleb walked among that multitude, his heart pounding with the reality of what was happening, his eyes taking in the sight of a people in motion toward a destiny they could barely imagine. Behind them, Egypt smoked with the aftermath of divine judgment. Before them stretched the wilderness, and beyond it, a land promised to Abraham's descendants centuries before. They were crossing a threshold that their parents and grandparents had only dreamed of, stepping into a freedom that had been deferred so long it had almost been forgotten. Caleb noticed Moses at the head of the procession, the man who had spoken to God, who had confronted Pharaoh, whose staff had been the instrument of plagues. There was something about him that commanded attention without demanding it, an authority that came not from personal charisma, but from the presence that rested upon him. Beside Moses walked a younger man named Joshua, whose bearing marked him as a warrior, whose eyes were constantly scanning the horizon for threats, whose loyalty to Moses was evident in every gesture of protective attention. Caleb found himself drawn to these men, sensing in them the same fierce faith that burned in his own chest. Joshua in particular caught his attention, a man not much older than himself, a man whose strength was evident, but whose strength was clearly rooted in something deeper than physical capability. They would become friends in the years ahead, brothers in arms and brothers in faith, the two men out of an entire generation who would refuse to let fear determine their destiny. But all of that lay in the future. For now, Caleb simply walked, one foot following the other, away from the only life he had ever known, and toward a future that shimmered with promise even as it bristled with uncertainty. The God who had broken Pharaoh's power was leading them. The God who had passed over their households while striking their oppressors was going before them in pillar of cloud and fire. Whatever challenges awaited, whatever obstacles lay between them and the promised land, Caleb was prepared to face them. He was not just a survivor anymore. He was not just an endurer of circumstances beyond his control. He was a man who had witnessed the power of God and had decided, in the deepest core of his being, that he would follow this God with his whole heart for the rest of his life. The road ahead would test that commitment in ways Caleb could not yet imagine. There would be battles and setbacks, years of waiting that would seem endless, moments when faith would be the only thing standing between him and despair. But the decision made in the aftermath of Passover, in the chaos of Exodus, in the first steps of freedom, would hold firm through every trial. A young warrior was emerging from the mud pits of Egypt, his chains fallen away, his heart burning with a fire that 40 years of wilderness wandering would only refine and strengthen. God had more for him than survival. God had a mountain waiting for him, decades in the future, a promise that would require a lifetime of faithfulness to claim. And Caleb, the dog, the Kenizzite, the slave who had been born for freedom, was ready to begin the journey that would lead him there. 2 years had passed since the night of Passover, 2 years of journey and revelation, of wilderness wandering and divine encounter. The people who had walked out of Egypt had been transformed at the foot of Mount Sinai, where fire and smoke had descended, and the voice of God had spoken commandments that would shape a nation's identity for millennia. They had built a tabernacle according to patterns shown on the mountain, had organized themselves into a marching order that placed the presence of God at the center of their community, had become something more than a fleeing mob of former slaves. They had become Israel, a covenant people bound to Yahweh by sacred agreement. Caleb had grown during those 2 years, not just in physical maturity, but in understanding of the God who had delivered them. He had witnessed the glory descending on Sinai, had heard the thunder of divine speech, had watched Moses ascend into the cloud and return with tablets of stone bearing words written by the finger of God. He had also witnessed the golden calf incident, when the people's patience ran thin and they demanded gods they could see, when Aaron crafted an idol from Egyptian gold and called it the Lord who had brought them out of Egypt. That day had taught Caleb something about the fragility of faith, about how quickly hearts could turn from the God of fire to gods of gold, about the constant battle between trust and fear that would characterize Israel's relationship with Yahweh. Now they stood at the edge of Canaan, the land that had been promised to Abraham's descendants 4 centuries earlier. The wilderness of Paran stretched behind them. Before them rose the hill country that marked the southern boundary of the land of milk and honey. The journey from Egypt to this threshold had taken longer than necessary. A direct route would have required weeks, not years. But God had his reasons for the delays, his purposes in the detours, his intentions in the time spent at Sinai receiving law and building tabernacle. Now finally the goal was in sight. The land that had existed as promise was about to become reality. Moses gathered the leaders of the tribes for an announcement. The Lord had commanded that spies be sent into Canaan to explore the land, to assess its inhabitants, to bring back a report that would inform the nation as they prepared for conquest. 1 man from each tribe would be selected for this mission. 12 spies representing the 12 tribes of Israel, men of standing and courage who could be trusted to see clearly and report accurately. Caleb's heart quickened when he heard his name, called as the representative of the tribe of Judah. He was not the oldest or the most prominent man in his tribe, but something in him had caught the attention of those who made such decisions. Perhaps the intensity of his faith, perhaps the fearlessness that marked his bearing, perhaps the reputation he had already begun to build as a man whose devotion to God was wholehearted and unwavering. Whatever the reason, he had been chosen. He would be among the 12 who would enter the promised land before all others, who would walk its soil and breathe its air and see with their own eyes what God had prepared for his people. Joshua was there too, representing the tribe of Ephraim. The friendship that had begun during the Exodus had deepened over the 2 years since, forged in shared conviction and mutual recognition of kindred spirits. Where others in the camp vacillated between faith and fear, Joshua and Caleb had remained steady, their trust in YHWH's promises unshaken by difficulties or delays. Now they would enter the land together, 2 men whose faith would soon be tested in ways that would separate them from an entire generation. The 12 set out on a morning bright with promise, crossing from the wilderness into the hill country of the Negev, the southern gateway to Canaan. The terrain changed as they travelled northward, the barren expanses of the wilderness giving way to rolling hills dotted with vegetation, the harsh beauty of the desert replaced by the softer beauty of a land that received rain and produced abundance. Springs bubbled up where water had been scarce. Trees provided shade where the sun had been merciless. The land itself seemed to welcome them, offering glimpses of the goodness that awaited those who would possess it. They explored for 40 days, their journey taking them from the southern wilderness to the far north, from the Jordan Valley to the Mediterranean coast. They saw cities perched on hilltops, their walls thick and their gates reinforced against invaders. They saw agricultural land that exceeded anything they had imagined, valleys where grapes grew in clusters so large that 2 men were required to carry a single bunch suspended on a pole between them. They saw the vineyards of Eshcol, whose produce would become the tangible evidence of Canaan's abundance. The proof that God's description of the land as flowing with milk and honey was not exaggeration, but understatement. But they also saw the inhabitants, and what they saw divided the 12 into 2 camps that would never be reconciled. The Canaanites were not a single people, but a collection of nations, Hittites and Amorites, Jebusites and Hivites, peoples who had lived in this land for generations and who had no intention of surrendering it to nomadic invaders from the wilderness. Their cities were fortified with walls that rose high and thick, engineered to withstand siege and assault. Their armies were equipped with iron weapons and chariots, technologies that the Israelites did not possess. Their populations were established and organized, rooted in the land in ways that gave them natural advantages over any force that might challenge their possession. And then there were the Anakim. The descendants of Anak were giants, men of extraordinary stature whose very appearance was enough to inspire terror in those who encountered them. They dwelt in Hebron and its surrounding territory, a mountainous region that would later become significant for reasons none of the spies could yet anticipate. Their size was not merely legendary. It was visible, undeniable, the kind of physical reality that could overwhelm careful reasoning and careful faith alike. When the spies saw the Anakim, 10 of them saw proof that conquest was impossible. 2 of them saw something else entirely. Caleb looked at the fortified cities and saw walls that God could bring down. He looked at the armed inhabitants and saw enemies that God could defeat. He looked at the giants of Anak and saw men, tall men, strong men, intimidating men, but men nonetheless, men who bled and died like any other men who served gods of wood and stone while Israel served the God who'd humiliated Egypt and parted the sea. The same faith that had been kindled on the night of Passover now blazed in response to Canaan's challenges. If God had promised this land, God would deliver this land. The obstacles were real, but the God who had overcome Pharaoh could certainly overcome the Anakim. Joshua saw the same things and reached the same conclusions. The 2 men discussed what they had observed during the long days of exploration, their conversations confirming what both already believed. The land was everything God had promised, and more, and the obstacles, formidable as they appeared, were no match for the power that had brought them this far. They would return to the camp with a report of faith, a testimony of confidence, a call to advance and possess what had been given. But the other 10 were seeing differently. The same fortified cities that Caleb saw as walls God could bring down, they saw as impenetrable barriers. The same armed inhabitants that Caleb saw as enemies God could defeat, they saw as invincible foes. The same giants that Caleb saw as men who could bleed and die, they saw as proof that Israel was hopelessly outmatched. Fear had entered their vision, and fear distorted everything it touched, magnifying threats and minimizing the God who had promised to overcome those threats. The return to the Israelite camp was a journey of mounting tension. Caleb and Joshua knew what the others were thinking, could see the fear written on their faces, could hear it in their conversations. 10 men had already decided that the mission was impossible, that the land could not be taken, that their report would counsel retreat rather than advance. The fruit of Eshcol that they carried, those magnificent grapes, those pomegranates and figs that testified to the land's abundance, would become exhibits in a trial where faith was being prosecuted and fear was presenting the case for the defense. The assembly gathered to hear the spies' report. The entire nation pressed close, eager to learn what awaited them in the land of promise. Caleb watched as the 10 began their presentation, their words carefully chosen to lead the audience toward a predetermined conclusion. "We went into the land which you sent us," they reported, "and it does flow with milk and honey. Here is its fruit." They held up the evidence of abundance, the grapes and pomegranates and figs that no one could deny. For a moment, hope flickered in the eyes of the assembled Israelites. Then came the word that poisoned everything. But the people who live there are powerful, and the cities are fortified and very large. We even saw descendants of Anak there. The Amalekites live in the Negev. The Hittites, Jebusites, and Amorites live in the hill country, and the Canaanites live near the sea and along the Jordan. The hope that had flickered began to fade, replaced by the familiar shadow of fear. But before the shadow could settle completely, Caleb stepped forward, his voice cutting through the murmur of anxiety that was spreading through the crowd. "We should go up and take possession of the land, for we can certainly do it." The words rang with conviction that refused to bend to the evidence of difficulty. Caleb was not denying what the others had seen. The fortified cities were real, the armed inhabitants were real, the giants were real. But reality included more than what human eyes could see. Reality included a God who had promised, a God who had delivered, a God whose power was not limited by the strength of those who opposed him. The same God who had broken Pharaoh's stubbornness would break Canaan's resistance. The same arm that had parted the sea would bring down the walls of fortified cities. The same presence that had led them through the wilderness would lead them to victory in the land. But the 10 were not finished. Caleb's faith only provoked them to speak more forcefully against the possibility of conquest. "We can't attack those people. They are stronger than we are. The land we explored devours those living in it. All the people we saw there are of great size. We saw the Nephilim there. The descendants of Anak come from the Nephilim. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we look the same to them." The comparison was devastating in its psychological impact. Grasshoppers and giants, insects and titans. The 10 spies had internalized a vision of themselves as insignificant, helpless, destined to be crushed by forces beyond their capacity to resist. And in that moment of collective self-diminishment, they forgot who walked among them. They forgot the pillar of fire and cloud. They forgot the manna that fell each morning. They forgot the water from the rock and the thunder from the mountain. They forgot God. The people wept that night. They wept and they complained and they voiced the cry that would seal their fate. If only we had died in Egypt or in this wilderness. They talked of choosing new leadership, of returning to the slavery from which they had been delivered, of rejecting the entire enterprise that had begun with the blood on their doorposts and the angel of death passing over. Joshua and Caleb tore their clothes in grief and tried one more time to turn the tide. "The land we passed through and explored is exceedingly good," Joshua pleaded. "If the Lord is pleased with us, he will lead us into that land, a land flowing with milk and honey, and will give it to us. Only do not rebel against the Lord, and do not be afraid of the people of the land, because we will devour them. Their protection is gone, but the Lord is with us. Do not be afraid of them." The appeal fell on ears deafened by fear. The crowd began talking of stoning Joshua and Caleb, of silencing the voices that dared to suggest faith might be stronger than fear. And then the glory of the Lord appeared at the tent of meeting, and the people fell silent before the presence they had forgotten, the power they had ignored, the God who had heard everything they had said. The verdict would come that night, a judgment that would shape the next 4 decades and determine which of the adults standing in that assembly would ever set foot in the land they had rejected. But in that moment, before the verdict was pronounced, Caleb stood with Joshua against the entire congregation, his voice drowned out but his conviction unshaken, his faith intact even as the faith of a nation crumbled around him. He had seen the land, he had seen the giants, and he had seen something the others had missed. The God who had promised was faithful, and no wall or warrior or giant could stand against his purposes. The night would bring consequences that Caleb could not yet imagine, but nothing that happened in that night or in the decades to follow would change what he knew to be true. The land could be taken, God would give it to them, and somehow, someday, the promise would be fulfilled. He would simply have to wait longer than anyone should have to wait for what had already been given. The verdict came that night, pronounced by the God whose glory had silenced the rebellious crowd. The adults who had wept and wished for death in Egypt would receive what they had requested. Not death in Egypt, but death in the wilderness, their bodies falling one by one across the years until an entire generation had been buried in the sand they had chosen over the soil of promise. Their children, whom they had claimed would become plunder for the Canaanites, would instead become the inheritors of what their parents had refused. 40 years the wandering would last, 1 year for each day the spies had explored the land, and at the end of those 40 years, only 2 men from the generation of the Exodus would remain alive to enter Canaan, Joshua and Caleb. Because my servant Caleb has a different spirit and follows me wholeheartedly, God declared, I will bring him into the land he went to, and his descendants will inherit it. A different spirit. The phrase marked Caleb as distinct from his generation, set apart not by superior ability or greater intelligence, but by the orientation of his heart. Where others had looked at Canaan and seen obstacles that dwarfed their God, Caleb had looked at the same landscape and seen obstacles that his God would dwarf. Where others had calculated the odds and concluded that faith was foolish, Caleb had trusted the promise and concluded that fear was faithless. The difference was not in what they saw, but in how they saw it. Not in the circumstances, but in the spirit that interpreted circumstances. That different spirit would now be tested in ways that Caleb could never have anticipated. Standing firm against a fearful generation had required courage. Waiting 4 decades for the fulfillment of a promise would require something deeper. Patience refined by grief. Hope sustained through endless delay. Faith that could survive the slow erosion of years without becoming bitter or brittle. The wilderness closed around the people of Israel like a door shutting on possibility. The land that had been within reach receded into the distance, accessible now only to memory and to the stubborn hope of those who believed they would eventually return. The march that should have continued into Canaan reversed direction, turning back into the barren expanses where survival itself was a daily struggle. The pillar of cloud and fire still led them, but it led them in circles, in holding patterns, in the aimless wandering of a people who had nowhere to go until a generation had finished dying. Caleb walked among them, his body still strong, his faith still intact, his heart heavy with the weight of what might have been. He had seen the land. He had tasted its fruit. He had stood on its soil and breathed its air and imagined the life that awaited his people in that place of abundance. Now that vision receded with each step away from Canaan's border, becoming not less real, but more precious, a treasure stored in memory against the day when memory would become reality again. The grief was substantial, and Caleb did not pretend it away. He had believed they would enter the land immediately, had expected that his bold declaration before the assembly would rally the people to faith, had hoped that his voice and Joshua's would be enough to turn the tide of fear. Instead, they had nearly been stoned. Instead, the people had chosen slavery over struggle, death over difficulty, the familiar misery of Egypt over the unfamiliar challenges of Canaan. The opportunity had been squandered, and no amount of faith could undo what unbelief had done. But grief did not become bitterness in Caleb's heart. He watched his contemporaries begin to die. The men and women who had walked out of Egypt with him, who had crossed the sea with him, who had stood at Sinai with him, and he mourned them without hating them. They had been wrong, terribly wrong, catastrophically wrong in their choice of fear over faith. But they had also been human, susceptible to the same doubts that whispered at the edges of every believer's consciousness, vulnerable to the same fears that lurked in every heart that had not been entirely conquered by trust. Caleb could condemn their choice without condemning their humanity. He could grieve their fate without despising their weakness. This compassion for a wandering nation became one of the marks of his different spirit. Lesser men might have held themselves aloof from those whose unbelief had cost them 40 years of waiting. Lesser men might have nursed resentment, might have reminded everyone at every opportunity that they had been right while the majority had been wrong, might have made their vindication into a weapon that they wielded against those who had rejected their counsel. Caleb did none of these things. He walked with his people, shared their hardships, buried their dead, and waited with them for the fulfillment that their unbelief had delayed but could not ultimately prevent. The wilderness years had their own rhythms, their own patterns of survival that became familiar through endless repetition. Each morning brought manna, that mysterious bread from heaven that appeared with the dew and sustained life in a land where no natural sustenance was available. Caleb gathered it like everyone else, ate it like everyone else, gave thanks for it like everyone else. The miracle had become routine, which was itself a kind of danger, a domestication of the divine that could make people forget they were dependent on daily supernatural provision. Caleb tried not to let routine become forgetfulness. Each morning's manna was fresh evidence that God had not abandoned them, that divine faithfulness continued even when human faithfulness had failed. Water came from rocks when Moses struck them at God's command, streams flowing in deserts where no streams had any natural right to flow. Clothing did not wear out, sandals did not fall apart, the physical necessities of life were provided through means that defied explanation. The people lived in a sustained miracle, though many of them seemed not to notice, seemed to take the supernatural for granted, seemed to complain about the monotony of manna without appreciating the wonder of its existence. The sandstorms came unpredictably, walls of grit that swept across the wilderness and forced everyone into their tents, waiting for the wind to pass, breathing through cloth pressed against faces, feeling the abrasive particles work their way into every fold of fabric and every crease of skin. Caleb sat through these storms like everyone else, listening to the howl of wind that seemed to mock human pretension, watching the world outside disappear into a brown blur of driven sand. These were hours for reflection, for prayer, for the interior work that the exterior chaos made unavoidable. He thought often of the land during these storm-bound hours. He replayed the 40 days of exploration in his memory, walking again through the hill country, seeing again the fortified cities and the abundant vineyards and the giants who had terrified his companions. The images did not fade with time. If anything, they grew sharper, more detailed, more precious as the years accumulated between that brief glimpse and its eventual fulfillment. The land waited for him. God had promised. The promise would be kept. He thought also of the mountain, Hebron, where the Anakim dwelt, where the giants had their stronghold, where the most formidable obstacles to conquest were concentrated. Something about that mountain had captured his imagination during the exploration, had lodged itself in his heart as more than just another piece of Canaanite territory. The difficulty of Hebron attracted rather than repelled him. The challenge of displacing the giants called to something in his different spirit that wanted faith to be tested against the hardest possible circumstances. If the land was to be taken by faith, let faith be proven against Hebron's giants. If God's power was to be demonstrated, let it be demonstrated where human power was most clearly insufficient. The years passed. Caleb watched his 40th birthday come and go, then his 50th, then his 60th. The young warrior who had walked out of Egypt was becoming an old man by the standards of his era. Though his strength showed no sign of failing, his vigour no sign of diminishing. The different spirit that had set him apart at Kadesh Barnea seemed to preserve his body as well as his faith, keeping him ready for a battle that might still be decades away. He began to mentor younger men, the sons of the generation that was dying. the children who had been deemed too young to bear responsibility for their parents' unbelief. These boys were growing into warriors, and they needed someone to teach them what warfare in service of God looked like, what faith in the face of impossible odds required, what it meant to follow Wedge wholeheartedly. Caleb became that teacher for many of them, passing on the lessons he had learned in Egypt and at Sinai and at the border of Canaan. He told them about the night of Passover, about the blood on the doorposts and the death that passed over. He told them about the sea parting and the Egyptian army drowning. He told them about the mountain wreathed in fire and the voice of God shaking the ground beneath their feet. He told them about the land their parents had refused, the land that waited for a generation with courage enough to claim it. He told them about the giants, not minimizing their size or their threat, but placing them in the context of a God whose power dwarfed every human enemy. "We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes," he would say, quoting the 10 spies who had spread fear through the camp. "But grasshoppers are what we seem like when we forget who walks with us. When we remember the giants are the grasshoppers, and we are the ones who will devour them." The young men listened, some with faith kindling in their hearts, others with the skepticism of those who had grown up hearing their parents' excuses for unbelief. Caleb planted seeds where he could, watered what had been planted by others, and trusted that God would bring the harvest in his own time. He could not force faith on anyone. He could only model it, teach it, embody it, and leave the results to the one who'd called him. Joshua remained his closest companion through the wilderness years, the one friend who fully understood what it meant to wait for a promise while a generation died around them. They spoke often of the future, of the conquest that would eventually come, of the strategies that might be employed against Canaan's fortified cities. They kept their minds sharp for the work that awaited, refusing to let the decades of delay dull their readiness. When the time came, and they both believed absolutely that the time would come, they would be prepared to lead a new generation into the land their parents had rejected. The 40th year arrived, and with it, the last of the Exodus generation began to die. Aaron fell on Mount Hor, his priestly garments transferred to his son Eleazar in a ceremony that marked the transition between generations. Miriam had died earlier, her voice that had led the women in song at the sea now silenced. Moses himself was told that he would not enter the land, his moment of disobedience at the waters of Meribah costing him the privilege of completing what he had begun. Of all the adults who had left Egypt, only Joshua and Caleb remained, their survival a testimony to the promise that God had made and would keep. Caleb stood at the edge of the wilderness as the 40th year drew to a close, looking toward the land he had seen 4 decades earlier. He was 80 years old now, but his eyes were not weak, and his strength had not faded. The body that should have aged like every other body had been preserved by the same grace that had sustained his faith through the waiting. He was ready. He had been ready for 40 years. And now, finally, impossibly, after a lifetime of patience that would have broken lesser spirits, the waiting was about to end. The new generation had grown to adulthood. The warriors he had trained were now men with families of their own, men who had heard the stories of Egypt and Sinai and Kadesh Barnea, men who were ready to write a different ending to the story their parents had abandoned. Joshua was about to assume leadership from Moses, was about to lead the people across the Jordan and into the land of promise. And Caleb, the old man with the young man's heart, the warrior whose faith had never wavered through 4 decades of delay, would be there beside him. Not as a spectator, but as a fighter, not as a relic of the past, but as a leader of the future, not asking for exemption from the battles ahead, but for the hardest battle of all. Hebron still waited. The giants still dwelt there. And Caleb still wanted that mountain, wanted it more than ever, wanted to prove in his 80th year what he had believed in his 40th, that God was faithful, that faith was vindicated, that those who follow wholeheartedly receive what has been promised. The wilderness had been long, but it had not been wasted, and the mountain that had called to him across the decades was finally, blessedly within reach. Moses climbed Mount Nebo alone, his aged frame ascending the slopes that overlooked the Jordan Valley and the land that spread beyond it like a tapestry of promise. The man who had confronted Pharaoh, who had stretched his staff over the sea, who had received the law on Sinai and mediated between God and Israel for 40 years, would go no further. His disobedience at the waters of Meribah, striking the rock in anger when God had commanded him to speak to it, had barred him from crossing the Jordan. He would see the land from a distance, but his feet would never touch its soil. Caleb watched from below as the great prophet disappeared into the heights, knowing he would not return. The grief was real, but tempered by understanding. Moses had completed his appointed work. He had brought a nation out of slavery, had shaped them into a people, had given them law and tabernacle and the knowledge of work that would define their identity forever. That his journey ended here, within sight of the goal but not within its boundaries, was a sorrow but not a tragedy. The work would continue. The promise would be fulfilled. Others would complete what Moses had begun. When Moses did not return from the mountain, Israel mourned for 30 days. The weeping echoed through the camp, grief for a leader whose like would not be seen again, whose intimacy with God had been unique in all of Israel's history. Caleb mourned with the rest, honouring the man who had recognised his different spirit, who had selected him for the mission to explore Canaan, who had stood beside him and Joshua when the congregation had threatened to stone them. Moses had been more than a leader to Caleb. He had been a model of what it meant to walk with God through impossible circumstances, to speak for God when no one wanted to listen, to remain faithful when faithfulness seemed futile. But mourning gave way to movement. Joshua, son of Nun, the warrior who had been Moses' aide since youth, assumed the leadership that had been designated for him. The mantle passed smoothly, prepared for by years of training and divine confirmation. Joshua was not Moses. No one could be Moses, but he was the leader God had chosen for this moment, the commander who would take the people where Moses could not go. The spirit that rested on him was the spirit of a conqueror, a general whose faith was matched by tactical brilliance, whose trust in God would be expressed through strategic genius. Caleb stood among the few who remembered what it had been like before the wilderness, before the wandering, before the long decades of waiting. Most of the adults in the camp had been children when the spies returned with their conflicting reports, too young to bear responsibility for their parents' unbelief, too young to be numbered among those condemned to die without seeing the land. They had grown up on wilderness stories, on manna and miracles, on the tales their parents told of Egypt and Exodus and the great refusal at Kadesh Barnea. But they had not experienced these things as adults. They knew them second-hand, filtered through memory and narrative. Caleb's knowledge was different. He had been there, fully present, an adult witness to everything that had shaped Israel's journey. He remembered Egypt not as a story, but as a reality he had lived. The mud pits and the whips and the hopelessness that had pressed upon him until Passover night shattered the darkness. He remembered the sea parting, the walls of water standing impossibly on either side, the Egyptian army drowning in the returning flood. He remembered Sinai wreathed in fire, the voice of God shaking the ground, the tablets of stone descending in Moses' hands. And he remembered Canaan, the grapes of Eshcol, the fortified cities, the giants of Hebron, not as legend but as lived experience, images burned into memory by 40 days of walking through the land he was now about to enter again. This living memory made Caleb a bridge between generations, a link between the past that had formed Israel and the future that awaited them. The young warriors who would fight beside Joshua needed more than tactical training. They needed connection to the story that gave their battles meaning. Caleb provided that connection, his presence a reminder that the God who had acted in the past was the same God who would act in the present, that the promises made to Moses were still operative, that the faithfulness demonstrated at the sea would be demonstrated again at the Jordan and beyond. The crossing of the Jordan was the moment that made everything real. For 40 years the promised land had existed as promise, seen once by 12 spies, remembered, hoped for but not possessed. Now the people stood at the river's edge, and the Jordan was in flood stage, swollen with spring rains, a barrier that seemed to mock their approach. But Joshua gave the command, and the priest carrying the ark stepped into the water, and the river that should have swept them away instead stopped flowing, piling up in a heap far upstream while the riverbed dried beneath their feet. Caleb crossed with the rest, his sandals pressing against ground that should have been underwater, his. eyes taking in the miracle that recapitulated what had happened at the sea so long ago. God was confirming Joshua's leadership the same way he had confirmed Moses, by mastering water, by making a way where no way existed, by demonstrating that the same power that had delivered them from Egypt would deliver Canaan into their hands. The generation that had been too young to see the sea parting now witnessed its echo at the Jordan, their faith strengthened by the evidence of their own eyes. They set up camp at Gilgal on the plains of Jericho, and there they observed Passover for the first time in the land, remembering in Canaan the deliverance from Egypt that had made Canaan possible. The next day the manna ceased. For 40 years it had fallen, the daily bread that sustained life in a land where no natural food could be found. Now they ate the produce of Canaan, unleavened bread and roasted grain from the land itself, and the miracle that had begun at the Exodus completed itself in the provision of a land that would feed them from its own abundance. Caleb tasted the grain of Canaan and felt the rightness of it, the fulfillment of something that had been promised so long ago that promise and reality had sometimes seemed impossible to reconcile. This was real. This was happening. The land that had existed in memory and hope was now beneath his feet, its food in his mouth, its air in his lungs. 45 years after he had first walked this soil as a spy, he was back. Not as an explorer this time, but as a conqueror. Not as a young man bringing a report, but as an old warrior ready to fight. The conquest began with Jericho, that ancient city whose walls rose formidable against any conventional assault. Joshua received his instructions directly from the commander of the Lord's army, a mysterious figure who appeared with drawn sword and accepted worship that no mere angel could receive. The strategy made no military sense. March around the city once a day for 6 days, 7 times on the 7th day, then shout and watch the walls fall. It was a plan designed to demonstrate that victory came from God, not from human tactics or strength. Caleb marched with the army around Jericho's walls, his aged legs keeping pace with warriors a third his age, his faith finding confirmation in the absurdity of the strategy. This was how God worked. This was what trusting Waj looked like in practice, obeying commands that seemed foolish, believing promises that seemed impossible, acting on divine instruction when human wisdom counseled differently. He had been doing this his whole life. Jericho was simply another opportunity to demonstrate that faith, not force, was the foundation of victory. The walls fell on the 7th day, collapsed into rubble by the shout of a people who believed that shouts could topple walls because their God had said so. The city was devoted to destruction, its inhabitants and its wealth offered to Waj as the first fruits of conquest, a declaration that everything Israel would gain in Canaan was ultimately his gift rather than their achievement. Ai followed, with its initial failure that taught Israel about the cost of hidden sin, and its eventual victory that proved God's faithfulness once the sin had been addressed. The southern campaign rolled through Canaan like thunder, coalition after coalition of kings falling before Joshua's army. Makkedah, Libnah, Lachish, Eglon, Hebron, Debir, cities that had seemed impregnable proving powerless against the God who fought for Israel. Caleb fought in these battles, his sword arm strong, his courage undiminished, his presence among the younger warriors a living testimony that faith did not weaken with age. He watched as the military strategy unfolded, as Joshua's brilliance combined with divine intervention to produce victories that exceeded anything tactical planning alone could achieve. The fortified cities that had terrified the 10 spies were falling. The armed inhabitants that had seemed invincible were being defeated. The land that fear had rejected was being taken by faith. But through all the campaigns, through all the victories, through all the territories being conquered and allocated, Caleb's heart remained fixed on one particular mountain, Hebron, the stronghold of the Anakim, the place where the giants still dwelt, unconquered despite the southern campaign's sweep through the region. Other cities had fallen, but Hebron remained, its giant inhabitants holding their ground, waiting for someone to challenge them directly. The promise echoed in Caleb's heart with every battle he fought, every march he completed, every night he spent in the camp of a conquering army. Moses had spoken it 45 years earlier, in the aftermath of the disastrous report, when Caleb alone among his contemporaries had stood firm. The land on which your feet have walked will be your inheritance and that of your children forever, because you have followed the Lord my God wholeheartedly. The land on which his feet had walked, Hebron, the mountain of the giants, the territory that any sensible warrior would avoid, that any rational allocation of resources would assign to younger, stronger men, that represented the ultimate test of whether the faith Caleb had professed for 45 years was genuine or merely theoretical. He had not forgotten the promise. He had not let the decades of waiting dilute his expectation. He had not allowed the victories of others to satisfy his own longing for the specific inheritance that had been designated for him. Hebron was his. God had said so. Moses had confirmed it. And now, finally, with the major campaigns complete and the time for allocation approaching, Caleb was ready to claim what had been promised. He watched Joshua prepare to divide the land among the tribes, knowing that his moment was coming. The younger warriors who had fought beside him knew nothing of the promise made before they were born. The tribal leaders who would receive their territories had no idea that one old man among them carried a claim that predated their generation's existence. But Caleb knew, and God knew, and Joshua, who had stood beside him on that terrible day at Kadesh Barnea, knew as well. The conversation that would change everything was approaching. Caleb had waited 45 years to speak the words that would claim his inheritance. He had fought through campaigns that proved his strength had not diminished. He had demonstrated in battle after battle that age had not weakened his arm or his courage. Now he would approach Joshua, not as a suppliant asking for favours, but as a warrior demanding what had been promised. The hardest land, the most dangerous territory, the mountain where giants still defied the God of Israel. Give me this mountain. The words formed in his heart, waiting for the moment when they would finally be spoken aloud. Give me the land you promised. Give me the challenge everyone else fears. Give me the opportunity to prove at 85 what I declared at 40, that the God who brought us out of Egypt can certainly bring down the giants of Hebron. The moment was coming, and Caleb, whose faith had never wavered through 4 decades of waiting, was ready to claim the inheritance that had been his since before the wilderness began. The major campaigns were complete, and Israel gathered at Gilgal to receive what God had promised. Joshua stood before the assembled tribes, the commander whose leadership had brought them victory after victory, whose faith had been vindicated in the rubble of Jericho and the conquest of the southern and northern coalitions. The time had come to divide the land, to transform military victory into permanent possession, to allocate territories that would become tribal homelands for generations to come. The process would be lengthy and complex. Each tribe would receive its portion, boundaries would be drawn, inheritances would be assigned based on family size and the casting of sacred lots. Priests and Levites would receive cities scattered throughout the tribal territories rather than a concentrated homeland of their own. The great work of settlement was beginning, the transition from conquest to cultivation, from warfare to the daily rhythms of agricultural life that would characterize Israel's existence in the land. But before the formal allocation could proceed, one man stepped forward with a claim that predated the entire process, a promise that had been made 45 years earlier when most of those present had not yet been born. Caleb, son of Jephunneh the Kenizzite, approached Joshua in the presence of the men of Judah who had gathered around them. His bearing was erect, his stride confident, his eyes burning with the same fire that had marked him as different since the day he first saw Canaan's grapes and giants and declared that the land could be taken. He was 85 years old now, an age that should have bent his spine and dimmed his vision and relegated him to honoured retirement among those who had done their fighting in younger years. But nothing about Caleb suggested retirement. Nothing about his posture or his voice or his presence indicated a man ready to accept the quiet gratitude of a nation and fade into comfortable irrelevance. He spoke, and his words carried across the assembly with a clarity that silenced every other conversation. You know what the Lord said to Moses, the man of God, at Kadesh Barnea about you and me. The opening was deliberate, grounding what would follow in shared history, in divine declaration, in a promise that Joshua had witnessed firsthand. You know. The words were not an appeal for Joshua to remember something he might have forgotten. They were an assertion of common knowledge, a foundation upon which the claim would be built. I was 40 years old when Moses, the servant of the Lord, sent me from Kadesh Barnea to explore the land, and I brought him back a report according to my convictions. But my fellow Israelites who went up with me made the hearts of the people melt in fear. I, however, followed the Lord my God wholeheartedly. The contrast was stated without bitterness. The failure of the 10 spies mentioned not to condemn them, but to establish the context for the promise that had followed. Caleb had done what the others had not done. He had followed wholeheartedly, had reported according to conviction rather than fear, had stood against the consensus of his contemporaries and the tide of popular opinion. The claim he was about to make rested on that distinction. He had earned what he was about to request, not through merit that put God in his debt, but through faithfulness that activated the promise God had freely made. So on that day Moses swore to me, "The land on which your feet have walked will be your inheritance and that of your children forever, because you have followed the Lord my God wholeheartedly." The promise was specific, not vague assurance of blessing but concrete designation of territory. The land on which his feet had walked during those 40 days of exploration, the land he had seen with his own eyes and assessed with his own judgment, the land where his sandals had pressed against Canaanite soil, while his heart had burned with faith that God would give what he had promised. That land was his. Moses had said so. God had confirmed it. 45 years of waiting had not nullified the promise. They had only delayed its fulfillment. Now then, just as the Lord promised, he has kept me alive for 45 years since the time he said this to Moses, while Israel moved about in the wilderness. So here I am today, 85 years old. The arithmetic was precise, the timeline calculated, the survival itself presented as evidence of divine faithfulness. God had promised the land, and God had preserved the life of the one to whom the promise was made. 45 years, long enough for an entire generation to be born, grow to adulthood, and bear children of their own. Long enough for everyone who had heard the original promise to die, except the one who had received it. Long enough to test whether faith could endure when fulfillment was delayed beyond all reasonable expectation. And here he was, 85 years old, still alive, still standing, still ready. I am still as strong today as the day Moses sent me out. I'm just as vigorous to go out to battle now as I was then. The claim was audacious, the kind of statement that might have drawn skeptical glances if spoken by anyone else. Men did not remain as strong at 85 as they had been at 40. Bodies weakened, muscles atrophied. The vigour of youth gave way to the frailty of age. This was the natural order, the expected progression, the common experience of everyone who lived long enough to grow old. But Caleb was not speaking from delusion or denial. He was stating observable fact, testifying to what the campaigns of conquest had demonstrated repeatedly. He had fought beside younger warriors and kept pace with them. He had marched with the army around Jericho's walls and shown no sign of failing strength. He had participated in battle after battle, his sword arm as effective as any in the host, his endurance matching that of men half his age. The different spirit that had set him apart at Kadesh Barnea had apparently preserved his body as well as his faith, maintaining physical capacity that should have declined decades earlier. God had kept him alive. God had kept him strong. The same faithfulness that had made the promise was now making the fulfillment possible. Then came the request, the words that had been forming in Caleb's heart for 45 years, the claim that would define the final chapter of his remarkable life. Now give me this hill country that the Lord promised me that day, the hill country, not the fertile valleys that would be easier to farm, not the coastal plains that would offer access to trade and prosperity, not the well-watered regions that would make settlement comfortable and agriculture reliable. The hill country, rugged, difficult, demanding terrain that would challenge even young men in the prime of their strength. And not just any hill country. Caleb was specific about what he wanted. You yourself heard then that the Anakim were there and their cities were large and fortified, but the Lord helping me, I will drive them out just as he said. The Anakim, the giants, the very people whose presence had terrified the 10 spies and melted the hearts of the congregation at Kadesh Barnea. The descendants of Anar still dwelt in the hill country of Hebron, still occupied their fortified cities, still represented the most formidable military challenge remaining in all of Canaan. Other territories had been cleared of serious opposition during the campaigns. The hill country around Hebron remained giant-infested, unconquered, waiting for someone with faith enough, or foolishness enough, to attempt what seemed impossible. Caleb was not asking for the easiest inheritance. He was demanding the hardest one. The request revealed everything about the different spirit that had marked him from the beginning. A man seeking comfort would have asked for something else. A man motivated by self-interest would have requested fertile land that would make him wealthy with minimal effort. A man who had spent 45 years waiting might have felt entitled to an inheritance that compensated for the waiting, something pleasant and profitable that would reward decades of patience. But Caleb wanted the challenge. He wanted the fight that everyone else feared. He wanted to prove at 85 what he had believed at 40, that the giants were not too big for God, that the fortified cities were not too strong for faith, that the obstacles which had paralyzed a generation were merely opportunities for divine power to be displayed. "The Lord helping me, I will drive them out just as he said." The phrase was crucial. Caleb was not claiming that he would conquer Hebron through his own strength, was not boasting that his personal prowess would bring down the Anakim. He was expressing faith, the same faith he had expressed 45 years earlier, the faith that looked at giants and saw men who served powerless gods, the faith that looked at fortified cities and saw walls that the Lord could bring down. The victory would be God's, the strength would be God's. Caleb was simply making himself available as the instrument through which divine power would work. "Perhaps the Lord will be with me, and I will drive them out." Some translations render this phrase differently, but the essence remained. Caleb's confidence was not in himself, but in the God who had promised. The perhaps was not doubt but humility, the acknowledgement that even faithful warriors depend on divine presence rather than human ability. If God was with him, the giants would fall. If God was with him, the fortified cities would be taken. If God was with him, the inheritance would be secured. And why would God not be with the man who had followed him wholeheartedly for 85 years? Joshua looked at his old friend, his brother in faith, the only other survivor from the generation that had walked out of Egypt. They had stood together at Kadesh Barnea, their voices united in calling the people to faith, their robes torn in grief when the people chose fear instead. They had walked together through 40 years of wilderness, had kept faith together when everyone around them was dying in unbelief, had entered Canaan together and fought together in campaign after campaign. Joshua knew Caleb's heart. Joshua knew his strength. Joshua knew that this request was not the fantasy of a delusional old man, but the culmination of a lifetime of faith that deserved the opportunity to prove itself one final time. Then Joshua blessed Caleb son of Jephunneh and gave him Hebron as his inheritance. The blessing was both spiritual and legal, divine approval and official allocation combined in a single act of recognition. Hebron belonged to Caleb now, not just in promise but in assignment, not just in hope but in title. The territory that had captured his imagination 45 years earlier, the mountain where the giants still defied the God of Israel, the inheritance that represented the ultimate test of faith against fear, it was his. What remained was the taking. The text notes that Hebron was formerly called Kiriath Arba, named after Arba, the greatest man among the Anakim. The greatest of the giants had given his name to this city, and now the city was being given to a man who believed that Israel's God was greater than any giant, that faith was stronger than fear, that promises made by HWH were promises that would be kept regardless of what obstacles stood in the way. Caleb left the assembly at Gilgal with his inheritance assigned, his claim recognized, his final battle waiting. The men of Judah who would fight with him understood what they were undertaking, an assault on the most heavily defended territory in the region, a confrontation with enemies who had terrorized an entire generation, a campaign that would test whether the faith proclaimed was the faith practiced. The 85-year-old warrior gathered his forces and turned toward the hill country, toward Hebron, toward the mountain that had been calling to him across 45 years of waiting. The giants still sat in their fortresses. The walls of their cities still rose against the sky. The descendants of Anak still believed themselves invincible, unconquerable, the lords of a territory that no one had dared to challenge directly. They had not yet met Caleb, son of Jephunneh. They had not yet encountered a man whose different spirit had been forged in Egypt's mud pits, refined in 40 years of wilderness waiting, and proven in the campaigns that had already swept through Canaan like divine fire. They had not yet faced the faith that had looked at their ancestors 45 years earlier and declared, "We can certainly take this land." That faith was coming for them now, carried by an old man with a young man's strength, climbing toward the mountain that God had promised and Caleb had never stopped believing he would receive. The conquest of Hebron was about to begin. The hill country rose before Caleb and his warriors like a fortress built by the earth itself. The terrain that had seemed so promising during the 40 days of exploration now revealed its defensive advantages to those who approached as invaders rather than observers. Ridges created natural barriers. Valleys channeled movement in ways that could become death traps for armies that did not understand the landscape. Rocky outcroppings provided positions from which defenders could rain destruction upon attackers, and at the heart of this forbidding territory stood Hebron, the city of the giants, the stronghold of the Anakim, the prize that Caleb had claimed and now must conquer. The men who marched with him were drawn from the tribe of Judah, warriors who had proven themselves in the campaigns that had swept through Canaan under Joshua's leadership. They were younger than Caleb, most of them were younger than his children, but they had seen him fight, had watched him keep pace with the strongest among them, had heard him speak of faith in terms that made the impossible seem not merely possible but certain. They followed him, not because they were commanded to, but because something in his different spirit inspired confidence that transcended the obvious disparity between their numbers and the challenge before them. Caleb had taught many of these men during the wilderness years, had planted seeds of faith in their hearts before they were old enough to understand what faith would cost them. Now those seeds were bearing fruit. The warriors who climbed toward Hebron carried more than weapons. They carried a conviction that had been formed through years of instruction and example, a belief that the God who had parted the sea and toppled Jericho's walls would certainly defeat the giants who had defied him for far too long. The approach to Hebron was deliberate, methodical, designed to gather intelligence while applying pressure. Caleb's years had not diminished his tactical awareness. If anything, decades of observation and experience had sharpened his understanding of how to wage war effectively. He sent scouts ahead to assess the terrain and the enemy positions. He identified routes that would minimize exposure to ambush while maximizing the advantages his force possessed. He prepared his men mentally and spiritually for what they would face, reminding them that the giants who waited above were men. Large men, fierce men, but men nonetheless, men whose gods were powerless and whose confidence was misplaced. The Anakim watched from their positions as the Israelite force assembled on the slopes below their city. They had heard stories of what had happened elsewhere in Canaan. The walls of Jericho collapsing, the southern coalition crushed, city after city falling to the invaders who served a god whose power seemed to exceed anything the Canaanite deities could match. But Hebron had not fallen. The Anakim had not been challenged directly, and the confidence that came from generations of dominance had not yet been shattered by personal defeat. 3 names would be remembered from among the Anakim who defended Hebron: Sheshai, Ahiman, and Talmai, descendants of Anak, giants whose reputations had spread throughout the region. These were not ordinary warriors, but champions, men whose size and strength had become legendary, whose presence on a battlefield was often enough to break the courage of opposing forces before actual combat began. 45 years earlier, the sight of their predecessors had reduced the 10 spies to psychological paralysis, had made them feel like grasshoppers in their own estimation. These 3 carried the same genetic legacy, the same intimidating stature, the same assumption that their physical superiority made them invincible. They had never faced a man like Caleb. The assault on Hebron unfolded in stages, each phase building on the one before, each victory opening the path to the next objective. Caleb led from the front, his presence among the warriors a constant reminder that faith was not merely something spoken, but something lived. Not an abstraction for philosophers, but a weapon for those who trusted the God who had promised. His sword arm had not weakened, his courage had not diminished. His voice rang out across the battlefield with commands and encouragements that kept his men focused, united, committed to the task that God had assigned. The fighting was brutal, as all ancient warfare was brutal. The Anakim did not surrender their homeland easily. They contested every approach, every position, every foot of ground that led toward their stronghold. Their size gave them advantages in hand-to-hand combat, longer reach, greater strength, the psychological impact of facing opponents who towered above ordinary men. Lesser forces might have broken under the pressure, might have retreated in the face of such formidable resistance, might have concluded that the spies' assessment 45 years earlier had been correct after all. But Caleb's forces did not break. The faith that animated them proved stronger than the fear that the giants sought to inspire. They pressed forward through casualties, through setbacks, through moments when the outcome seemed uncertain. They trusted the promise that Caleb had claimed, the assurance that God had given this land to his servant, the confidence that divine faithfulness would not fail at the very moment when it was being tested most severely. The turning point came when Caleb himself engaged the giants directly. The accounts preserved in Scripture do not provide tactical details, do not describe the specific moments when Sheshai and Ahiman and Talmai fell before the Israelite assault. But fall they did. These champions of the Anakim, these descendants of Anak whose very names had embodied the terror that had paralysed a generation. Whether Caleb's own sword struck the decisive blows, or whether his leadership created the conditions in which others could deliver them, the result was the same. The giants who had seemed invincible proved vincible. The warriors who had trusted in their size discovered that size was not enough when facing a force empowered by the living God. Hebron fell. The city that had been named after the greatest of the Anakim, the stronghold that had anchored giant resistance for generations, opened before Caleb's assault like a fortified flower yielding to irresistible spring. The walls that had seemed so formidable, from a distance proved no more permanent than Jericho's walls had proven, no more capable of resisting divine purpose than any other human construction had ever been. The inhabitants who had defied the God of Israel discovered that defiance has its limits, that even giants cannot stand against the Creator of heaven and earth. The victory was complete, but the work was not finished. Caleb pushed beyond Hebron to the surrounding territories, driving out the remaining Anakim from the hill country that had been promised to him. Debir fell, formerly called Kiriath Sepher, its conquest offering an opportunity that Caleb seized to invest the next generation in the ongoing work of settlement. He offered his daughter Achsah in marriage to the warrior who captured the city, and his nephew Othniel rose to the challenge, winning both the military victory and the bride, becoming in the process the first of the judges who would lead Israel in the unsettled years after Joshua's death. The strategy was characteristic of Caleb's different spirit. Even at 85, even in the midst of his own triumph, he was thinking about what would come after, about the generations that would need to carry forward what his generation had begun. The marriage of Achsah to Othniel was not merely a reward for military achievement, it was an investment in the future, a merging of families and fortunes that would strengthen Judah's hold on the territory that had been so hard won. The evening after the final resistance had been crushed, Caleb walked among the hills that were now his own. The sun was setting over the western ridges, painting the sky in colours that seemed to celebrate what had been accomplished. The air of Hebron filled his lungs, air that had once been breathed by giants, air that would now sustain the descendants of a man who had refused to let fear determine his destiny. He was tired. The fatigue that adrenaline and faith had held at bay during the fighting settled over him now, reminding him that even different spirits inhabited mortal bodies. His muscles ached. His wounds, minor but numerous, stung with the aftermath of battle. 85 years pressed down upon him with a weight that he had somehow managed to ignore while the conquest demanded his attention. But the tiredness was satisfying rather than depleting, the weariness of accomplishment rather than defeat. He had done what he set out to do. He had claimed what had been promised. The mountain that had called to him across 45 years of waiting was finally, fully, completely his. He thought of the 10 spies who had seen this same land and pronounced it unconquerable. They were all dead now, buried in the wilderness they had chosen over the challenge of Canaan. Their fear had become their fate. The grasshopper mentality they had embraced had defined their destiny, had limited them to wandering when they could have been conquering, had condemned them to die within sight of the promise without ever possessing it. He thought of Joshua, his friend and fellow survivor, who was even now overseeing the allocation of territories throughout Canaan. They had stood together at Kadesh Barnea, the only voices calling for faith when everyone else was counselling fear. They had walked together through the wilderness years, had fought together in the campaigns of conquest, had lived to see what their contemporaries had refused to believe possible. The bond between them was forged in shared conviction and mutual survival, a friendship that had outlasted every other relationship from their generation. He thought of the God who had made the promise and kept it, who had preserved his life and his strength through decades that should have diminished both, who had given him not just survival, but victory, not just endurance, but triumph. The faith that had sustained him was not his own achievement, but a gift from the one who had called him to different spirit from the beginning. Everything he had accomplished was ultimately God's accomplishment through him, divine power working through human availability, supernatural faithfulness honouring human trust. The stars emerged as darkness gathered, the same stars that had witnessed his birth in Egyptian slavery, that had shone down on the night of Passover, that had kept silent vigil during 40 years of wilderness wandering. They seemed closer here on the mountain, brighter in the clear air of the hill country, a canopy of promise that stretched over the inheritance he had finally received. Caleb, son of Jephunneh, the Kenizzite, the man with the different spirit, the warrior who had followed God wholeheartedly, stood on his mountain as the night deepened around him. The giants were gone. The fortifications were breached. The land that had been promised was now possession. What remained was the living, the settling, the building, the planting that would transform conquered territory into permanent home. He had asked for the mountain, and he had received it. He had faced the giants, and he had defeated them. He had trusted the promise, and the promise had proven trustworthy. At 85 years old, after a lifetime of faith tested by waiting and proven by conquest, Caleb breathed the air of his inheritance and found it good. The battle was over, the victory was complete, and the man who had never stopped believing finally stood in the fullness of what he had believed for. The years that followed the conquest of Hebron were years of peace, the hard-won peace of a warrior who had earned the right to rest. Caleb settled into the land that had cost him 45 years of waiting and one fierce campaign of conquest, transforming the territory from battlefield to homeland, from contested ground to family inheritance. The hill country that had once harboured giants now sheltered the descendants of the man who had driven them out, generation following generation in the land that faith had claimed. Hebron became more than a personal possession. It became a symbol of what different spirit could accomplish. The city that had terrified an entire generation, the stronghold that had seemed impregnable to those who measured possibility by human capacity, stood now as testimony to the faithfulness of God and the fruitfulness of trust. Visitors who came to Hebron in later years would hear the story, how an 85-year-old man had demanded the hardest inheritance rather than the easiest, how he had faced the giants that everyone else feared, how he had proven in his final campaign what he had declared at the beginning, that God was able to give what he had promised. The land itself responded to cultivation as it had responded to conquest. Vineyards were planted on the same slopes where Anakim warriors had once stood guard. Olive groves took root in soil that had been watered by the blood of battle. Flocks grazed on hillsides that had witnessed the overthrow of giants. The abundance that the spies had reported 45 years earlier, the grapes so large they required 2 men to carry them, the land flowing with milk and honey, proved as real in experience as it had been in observation. Caleb's inheritance was not merely adequate, it was abundant, a portion of the promised land that exceeded what survival required and pointed toward the generosity of the God who had given it. Caleb watched his family multiply in the land, saw grandchildren and great-grandchildren born in Hebron, witnessed the establishment of a lineage that would carry his name and his faith into generations he would never meet. His daughter Achsah proved as bold as her father, approaching him after her marriage to request additional land, springs of water to complement the territory she had received. Caleb granted her request with a generosity that reflected his own experience of divine generosity, giving her both the upper and lower springs, ensuring that her inheritance would be fruitful for generations to come. The story of Achsa's request became part of the family legacy, a reminder that different spirit could be inherited as well as individual, that the boldness which had marked Caleb could mark his descendants as well. She had not hesitated to ask for what she needed. She had not been content with merely adequate provision when abundance was available. She had approached her father with confidence, and her confidence had been rewarded. The pattern repeated through generations, asking boldly, trusting fully, receiving generously. What had made Caleb different? The question echoed through the years as his story was told and retold, as later generations sought to understand what set him apart from the thousands who had walked out of Egypt with him and never reached the land they were promised. It was not superior ability. Caleb had possessed no extraordinary talents that distinguished him from his contemporaries, no genetic advantages that made him naturally braver or stronger or wiser than others. He had been a slave in Egypt like all the rest, had learned the same skills, had faced the same limitations, had started from the same position of powerlessness that characterized everyone in his generation. The difference was not in his raw material, but in what he did with it. It was not freedom from fear. Caleb had seen the same giants the other spies had seen, had observed the same fortified cities, had assessed the same military challenges. He was not blind to difficulty or immune to the natural human response of intimidation. The giants were genuinely large. The cities were genuinely fortified. The obstacles were genuinely formidable. Caleb did not pretend otherwise, did not minimize the challenges, did not suggest that conquest would be easy. He simply refused to let the challenges define what was possible. He measured possibility not by the size of the obstacles, but by the size of the God who had promised to overcome them. It was not absence of suffering. Caleb had endured 40 years of wilderness wandering, had watched his contemporaries die one by one around him, had waited longer than anyone should have to wait for a promise already given. He had not been spared the consequences of his generation's unbelief. He had simply been preserved through them. The wilderness years were real years, hard years, years when faith had to survive without the encouragement of visible progress. Caleb's different spirit was not demonstrated by exemption from difficulty, but by endurance through difficulty. The difference was wholehearted devotion. The phrase appears repeatedly in the biblical account, the defining characteristic that set Caleb apart. He followed the Lord his God wholeheartedly. Not partially, not occasionally, not when circumstances made faith convenient. Wholeheartedly, with complete commitment, undivided loyalty, total trust that held nothing back and hedged no bets. Wholehearted devotion meant that Caleb's faith was not compartmentalized, kept separate from the practical realities of daily life. When he looked at Canaan, he looked with the eyes that were already committed to trusting God's promise. When he assessed the military situation, he assessed it within a framework that included divine power as the decisive factor. When he spoke to the congregation at Kadesh Barnea, he spoke from a heart that had already decided that God's word was more reliable than human observation, that covenant promise was more certain than military calculation. This kind of devotion was not a single decision, but a continuous orientation, a daily choice to trust renewed every morning, a commitment that had to be maintained through decades of circumstances that could have justified abandonment. Caleb did not follow God wholeheartedly once and then coast on that initial commitment. He followed wholeheartedly through the wilderness years, through the campaigns of conquest, through the long process of settlement. The different spirit was not a moment but a lifetime, not an event but a pattern, not a peak experience but a sustained trajectory. The courage that had marked Caleb's public stands at Kadesh Barnea, at the allocation of territory, at the assault on Hebron, was rooted in a trust that went deeper than courage alone could reach. Courage without trust is merely recklessness, willingness to face danger without reason to believe that danger can be overcome. Caleb's courage was different because it was grounded in confidence that God's promises were reliable, that divine faithfulness was more certain than human strength, that the one who had spoken would certainly perform what he had spoken. This trust had been tested repeatedly and had repeatedly proven itself trustworthy. God had said he would bring Israel out of Egypt, and he had. God had said he would part the sea, and he had. God had said he would give them the land, and he was in the process of doing exactly that. Each fulfilled promise became foundation for trusting the next unfulfilled promise, each demonstration of divine faithfulness becoming evidence that future faithfulness could be expected. Caleb's faith was not blind. It was informed by history, supported by experience, confirmed by the accumulating testimony of God's reliability. And there was patience, the dimension of faith that the wilderness years had developed and refined. Patience is not passive waiting, not resignation to circumstances, not abandonment of expectation. True patience is active trust that maintains hope while accepting divine timing, that continues to believe when fulfillment is delayed, that refuses to let the gap between promise and possession become an excuse for abandoning either. Caleb had waited 45 years for an inheritance that could have been his in days. He had not grown bitter in the waiting. He had not concluded that God had forgotten or changed his mind. He had simply waited actively and faithfully until the waiting was over and the time for action had come. The legacy of this different spirit extended far beyond Caleb's individual life. His descendants inherited not just his land, but his example, a model of faith that could be studied and emulated by those who came after. The tribe of Judah, to which Caleb belonged by adoption, would eventually produce David, the king after God's own heart, whose own faith would echo the wholehearted devotion that Caleb had demonstrated centuries earlier. The line that led from Judah through the generations would ultimately produce Jesus of Nazareth, in whom all the promises made to Abraham found their ultimate fulfillment. Caleb's story was preserved in Scripture not as a historical curiosity, but as an invitation to consider what different spirit might look like in different circumstances, what wholehearted devotion might accomplish in different eras, what giants might be conquered by those who refuse to measure possibility by human limitation. Everyone has a mountain. The specific shape of the challenge varies from person to person, from generation to generation. For some, the mountain is a relationship that seems beyond healing, a reconciliation that appears impossible, a restoration that human effort cannot achieve. For others, the mountain is a calling that exceeds their apparent qualification, a task that demands more than they believe they have, a purpose that frightens as much as it attracts. For still others, the mountain is simply the accumulated weight of years and disappointments, the obstacles that have piled up over time until they seem as immovable as the hills around Hebron. But mountains that seem impossible from a human perspective are not impossible from a divine one. The God who gave Hebron to Caleb is the same God who invites every generation to trust him with their mountains, to approach him with the boldness of Achsah asking for springs of water, to claim by faith what cannot be claimed by strength alone. The different spirit that set Caleb apart is available to anyone willing to follow God wholeheartedly, to refuse the grasshopper mentality that measures self by the size of the obstacles, to believe that promises made by the Creator of heaven and earth are promises that will be kept. Faith is not measured by age. Caleb was 40 when he first declared that the land could be taken. He was 85 when he finally took the portion promised to him. The decades between did not diminish his faith. They deepened it. The years that might have eroded lesser commitment only strengthened his, refining his trust like gold refined in fire, producing a confidence at 85 that exceeded what he had possessed at 40. The God who preserved Caleb's strength is the same God who can sustain faith through any length of waiting, any season of delay, any wilderness that stretches between promise and possession. Before Caleb was born, God knew the mountain he would one day climb. Before the mud pits of Egypt, before the night of Passover, before the 40 years of wandering, the inheritance had been prepared, waiting for the man whose different spirit would make him capable of receiving it. The same is true for every person whose life is hidden with God. Purposes prepared before birth, mountains waiting to be climbed, inheritances ready to be claimed by those who follow wholeheartedly. The sun sets over Hebron, as it has set every evening since Caleb first breathed its air as conqueror rather than spy. The hills stand in silhouette against the fading light, the same hills that once sheltered giants and now shelter the descendants of the man who drove them out. The stars emerge one by one, the same stars that witnessed the exodus from Egypt, the parting of the sea, the long decades of wilderness wandering. They shine down on a land at peace, a promise fulfilled, a faith vindicated. Somewhere in those hills, in a tomb that marked the end of an extraordinary life, Caleb, son of Jephunneh, rested from his labours. The warrior who had refused to accept grasshopper identity had claimed his mountain and lived to enjoy its fruits. The man of different spirit had followed God wholeheartedly and had received what wholehearted followers receive: not exemption from difficulty, but triumph through difficulty; not escape from waiting, but faithfulness through waiting; not the avoidance of giants, but the conquest of giants, by the power of the God who keeps every promise he makes. His story echoes across the centuries, an invitation to everyone who hears it. What mountain is waiting for you? What giant stands between you and your inheritance? What promise has been given that seems too far away, too difficult, too impossible to claim? The God who gave Caleb his mountain is still giving mountains to those who ask. The different spirit that set one man apart is still available to all who will follow wholeheartedly. The faith that conquered Hebron's giants can still conquer whatever giants block the path to the life God has promised. Give me this mountain. The prayer rises from every generation, from every heart that refuses to settle for less than what God has offered. Give me the challenge that proves my faith is real. Give me the opportunity that exceeds my natural ability. Give me the inheritance that only wholehearted devotion can claim. And the God who answered Caleb answers still, his faithfulness unchanged across millennia, his power undiminished by the passage of time, his promises as certain today as they were on the day he made them. The mountain is waiting. The giants can be conquered. And the different spirit that changed everything for one man from the tribe of Judah is still changing everything for all who dare to follow God with their whole heart. Rise up. Claim your inheritance. Take the mountain. The God of Caleb is your God too, and he is faithful.